The buildings now lay quiet in the sunset, a vein here and there on their many spires and domes giving sparkle to a picture of sober secondary and tertiary hues. Reaching the bottom, he moved along the level way between pollard willows growing indistinct in the twilight, and soon confronted the outmost lamps of the town, some of those lamps which had sent into the sky the gleam and glory that caught his strained gaze in his days of dreaming so many years ago. They winked their yellow eyes at him dubiously, and as if, though they had been awaiting him all these years in disappointment at his tarrying, they did not much want him now. He was a species of Dick Whittington, whose spirit was touched to finer issues than a mere material gain. He went along the outlying streets with the cautious tread of an explorer. He saw nothing of the real city in the suburbs on this side. His first want being a lodging, he scrutinized carefully such localities as seemed to offer on inexpensive terms the modest type of accommodation he demanded, and after inquiry took a room in a suburb nicknamed Beersheba, though he did not know this at the time. Here he installed himself, and having had some tea, sallied forth. It was a windy, whispering, moonless night. To guide himself, he opened under a lamp a map he had brought. The breeze ruffled and fluttered it, but he could see enough to decide on the direction he should take to reach the heart of the place. After many turnings, he came up to the first ancient medieval pile that he had encountered. It was a college, as he could see by the gateway. He entered it, walked round, and penetrated to dark corners which no lamplight reached. Close to this college was another, and a little further on another, and then he began to be encircled, as it were, with the breath and sentiment of the venerable city. When he passed objects out of harmony with its general expression, he allowed his eyes to slip over them as if he did not see them. A bell began clanging, and he listened till 101 strokes had sounded. He must have made a mistake, he thought. It was meant for 100. When the gates were shut, and he could no longer get into the quadrangles, he rambled under the walls and doorways, feeling with his fingers the contours of their mouldings and carving. The minutes passed. Fewer and fewer people were visible, and still he serpentined among the shadows, for had he not imagined these scenes through 10 bygone years, and what mattered a night's rest for once? High against the black sky, the flash of a lamp would show crocketed pinnacles and indented battlements. Down obscure alleys, apparently never trodden now by the foot of man, and whose very existence seemed to be forgotten, there would jut into the path porticos, oriels, doorways of enriched and florid middle-age design, their extinct air being accentuated by the rottenness of the stones. It seemed impossible that modern thought could house itself in such decrepit and superseded chambers. Knowing not a human being here, Jude began to be impressed with the isolation of his own personality, as with a self-spectre, the sensation being that of one who walked but could not make himself seen or heard. He drew his breath pensively, and, seeming thus almost his own ghost, gave his thoughts to the other ghostly presences with which the nooks were haunted. During the interval of preparation for this venture, since his wife and furniture's uncompromising disappearance into space, he had read and learnt almost all that could be read and learnt by one in his position of the worthies who had spent their youth within these reverend walls, and whose souls had haunted them in their maturer age. Some of them, by the accidents of his reading, loomed out in his fancy disproportionately large by comparison with the rest. The brushings of the wind against the angles, buttresses, and door-jambs were as the passing of these only other inhabitants. The tappings of each ivy leaf on its neighbour were as the mutterings of their mournful souls. The shadows, as their thin shapes in nervous movement, making him comrades in his solitude. In the gloom it was as if he ran against them without feeling their bodily frames. The streets were now deserted, but on account of these things he could not go in. There were poets abroad, of early date and of late, from the friend and eulogist of Shakespeare down to him who has recently passed into silence, and that musical one of the tribe who is still among us. Speculative philosophers drew along, not always with wrinkled foreheads and hoary hair as in framed portraits, but pink-faced, slim, and active as in youth. Modern divines, sheeted in their surplices, among whom the most real to Jude Fawley were the founders of the religious school called Tractarian, the well-known three, the enthusiast, the poet, and the formularist, the echoes of whose teachings had influenced him even in his obscure home. A start of aversion appeared in his fancy to move them at sight of those other sons of the place, the form in the full-bottomed wig, statesman, rake, reasoner, and sceptic, the smoothly shaven historian so ironically civil to Christianity, with others of the same incredulous temper, who knew each quad as well as the faithful, and took equal freedom in haunting its cloisters. He regarded the statesmen in their various types, men of firmer movement and less dreamy air, the scholar, the speaker, the plodder, the man whose mind grew with his growth in years, and the man whose mind contracted with the same. The scientists and philologists followed on in his mind-sight in an odd, impossible combination, men of meditative faces, strained foreheads, and weak-eyed as bats with constant research. Then official characters, such men as governor-generals and lord-lieutenants, in whom he took little interest, chief justices and lord-chancellors, silent, thin-lipped figures of whom he knew barely the names. A keener regard attached to the prelates by reason of his own former hopes. Of them he had an ample band, some men of heart, others rather men of head, he who apologized for the church in Latin, the saintly author of the evening hymn, and near them the great itinerant preacher, hymn-writer, and zealot, shadowed like Jude by his matrimonial difficulties. Jude found himself speaking out loud, holding conversations with them, as it were, like an actor in a melodrama who apostrophizes the audience on the other side of the footlights, till he suddenly ceased with a start at his absurdity. Perhaps those incoherent words of the wanderer were heard within the walls by some student or thinker over his lamp, and he may have raised his head and wondered what voice it was, and what it betokened. Jude now perceived that, so far as solid flesh went, he had the whole aged city to himself, with the exception of a belated townsman here and there, and that he seemed to be catching a cold. A voice reached him out of the shade, a real and local voice. "You've been a-sittin' a long time on that plinth stone, young man. What med you be up to?" It came from a policeman who had been observing Jude without the latter observing him. Jude went home and to bed, after reading up a little about these men and their several messages to the world from a book or two that he had brought with him concerning the sons of the university. As he drew towards sleep, various memorable words of theirs that he had just been conning seemed spoken by them in muttering utterances, some audible, some unintelligible to him. One of the spectres, who afterwards mourned Christminster as the home of lost causes, though Jude did not remember this, was now apostrophizing her thus: "Beautiful city, so venerable, so lovely, so unravaged by the fierce intellectual life of our century, so serene. Her ineffable charm keeps ever calling us to the true goal of us all, to the ideal, to perfection. Another voice was that of the Corn Law convert, whose phantom he had just seen in the quadrangle with a great bell. Jude thought his soul might have been shaping the historic words of his master's speech. "Sir, I may be wrong, but my impression is that my duty towards a country threatened with famine requires that that which has been the ordinary remedy under all similar circumstances should be resorted to now, namely, that there should be free access to the food of man from whatever quarter it may come. Deprive me of office tomorrow, you can never deprive me of the consciousness that I have exercised the powers committed to me from no corrupt or interested motives, from no desire to gratify ambition, for no personal gain." Then the sly author of the immortal chapter on Christianity: "How shall we excuse the supine inattention of the pagan and philosophic world to these evidences, miracles, which were presented by omnipotence? The sages of Greece and Rome turned aside from the awful spectacle, and appeared unconscious of any alterations in the moral or physical government of the world." Then the shade of the poet, the last of the optimists: "How the world is made for each of us, and each of the many helped to recruit the life of the race by a general plan." Then one of the three enthusiasts he had seen just now, the author of the Apologia: "My argument was that absolute certitude as to the truths of natural theology was the result of an assemblage of concurring and converging probabilities, that probabilities which did not reach to logical certainty might create a mental certitude." The second of them, no polemic, muttered quieter things: "Why should we faint and fear to live alone, since all alone, so heaven has willed, we die?" He likewise heard some phrases spoken by the phantom with the short face, the genial spectator: "When I look upon the tombs of the great, every motion of envy dies in me. When I read the epitaphs of the beautiful, every ordinate desire goes out. When I meet with the grief of parents upon a tombstone, my heart melts with compassion. When I see the tombs of the parents themselves, I consider the vanity of grieving for those whom we must quickly follow." And lastly, a gentle-voiced prelate spoke, during whose meek, familiar rhyme, endeared to him from earliest childhood, Jude fell asleep: "Teach me to live that I may dread the grave as little as my bed. Teach me to die." He did not wake till morning. The ghostly past seemed to have gone, and everything spoke of today. He started up in bed, thinking he had overslept himself, and then said, "By Jove, I had quite forgotten my sweet-faced cousin, and that she's here all the time. And my old schoolmaster, too." His words about his schoolmaster had, perhaps, less zest in them than his words concerning his cousin. 2. Necessary meditations on the actual, including the mean bread and cheese question, dissipated the phantasmal for a while, and compelled Jude to smother high thinkings under immediate needs. He had to get up and seek for work, manual work, the only kind deemed by many of its professors to be work at all. Passing out into the streets on this errand, he found that the colleges had treacherously changed their sympathetic countenances. Some were pompous, some had put on the look of family vaults above ground. Something barbaric loomed in the masonries of all. The spirits of the great men had disappeared. The numberless architectural pages around him he read, naturally, less as an artist critic of their forms than as an artisan and comrade of the dead handicraftsman whose muscles had actually executed those forms. He examined the mouldings, stroked them as one who knew their beginning, said they were difficult or easy in the working, had taken little or much time, were trying to the arm or convenient to the tool. What at night had been perfect and ideal was by day the more or less defective real. Cruelties, insults had, he perceived, been inflicted on the aged erections. The condition of several moved him as he would have been moved by maimed, sentient beings. They were wounded, broken, sloughing off their outer shape in the deadly struggle against years, weather, and man. The rottenness of these historical documents reminded him that he was not, after all, hastening on to begin the morning practically as he had intended. He had come to work and to live by work, and the morning had nearly gone. It was, in one sense, encouraging to think that in a place of crumbling stones there must be plenty for one of his trade to do in the business of renovation. He asked his way to the workyard of the stonemason whose name had been given him at Alfredston, and soon heard the familiar sound of the rubbers and chisels. The yard was a little centre of regeneration. Here, with keen edges and smooth curves, were forms in the exact likeness of those he had seen abraded and time-eaten on the walls. These were the ideas in modern prose which the lichened colleges presented in old poetry. Even some of those antiques might have been called prose when they were new. They had done nothing but wait, and had become poetical. How easy to the smallest building, how impossible to most men. He asked for the foreman, and looked round among the new traceries, mullions, transoms, shafts, pinnacles, and battlements standing on the bankers half-worked or waiting to be removed. They were marked by precision, mathematical straightness, smoothness, exactitude. There, in the old walls, were the broken lines of the original idea, jagged curves, disdain of precision, irregularity, disarray. For a moment there fell on Jude a true illumination, that here in the stone-yard was a centre of effort as worthy as that dignified by the name of scholarly study within the noblest of the colleges. But he lost it under stress of his old idea. He would accept any employment which might be offered him on the strength of his late employer's recommendation, but he would accept it as a provisional thing only. This was his form of the modern vice of unrest. Moreover, he perceived that at best only copying, patching, and imitating went on here, which he fancied to be owing to some temporary and local cause. He did not at that time see that medievalism was as dead as a fern leaf in a lump of coal, that other developments were shaping in the world around him, in which Gothic architecture and its associations had no place. The deadly animosity of contemporary logic and vision towards so much of what he held in reverence was not yet revealed to him. Having failed to obtain work here, as yet, he went away, and thought again of his cousin, whose presence somewhere at hand he seemed to feel in wavelets of interest, if not of emotion. How he wished he had that pretty portrait of her! At last he wrote to his aunt to send it. She did so, with a request, however, that he was not to bring disturbance into the family by going to see the girl or her relations. Jude, a ridiculously affectionate fellow, promised nothing, put the photograph on the mantelpiece, kissed it, he did not know why, and felt more at home. She seemed to look down and preside over his tea. It was cheering, the one thing uniting him to the emotions of the living city. There remained the schoolmaster, probably now a reverend parson, but he could not possibly hunt up such a respectable man just yet, So raw and unpolished was his condition, so precarious were his fortunes. Thus he still remained in loneliness. Although people moved round him, he virtually saw none. Not as yet having mingled with the active life of the place, it was largely non-existent to him. But the saints and prophets in the window tracery, the paintings in the galleries, the statues, the busts, the gargoyles, the corbel heads, these seemed to breathe his atmosphere. Like all newcomers to a spot on which the past is deeply graven, he heard that past announcing itself with an emphasis altogether unsuspected by, and even incredible to, the habitual residents. For many days he haunted the cloisters and quadrangles of the colleges at odd minutes in passing them, surprised by impish echoes of his own footsteps, smart as the blows of a mallet. The Christminster sentiment, as it had been called, ate further and further into him, till he probably knew more about those buildings materially, artistically, and historically than any one of their inmates. It was not till now, when he found himself actually on the spot of his enthusiasm, that Jude perceived how far away from the object of that enthusiasm he really was. Only a wall divided him from those happy young contemporaries of his with whom he shared a common mental life, men who had nothing to do from morning to night but to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest. Only a wall, but what a wall! Every day, every hour, as he went in search of labor, he saw them going and coming also, rubbed shoulders with them, heard their voices, marked their movements. The conversation of some of the more thoughtful among them seemed oftentimes, owing to his long and persistent preparation for this place, to be peculiarly akin to his own thoughts. Yet he was as far from them as if he had been at the Antipodes. Of course he was. He was a young workman in a white blouse, and with stone dust in the creases of his clothes, and in passing him they did not even see him or hear him, rather saw through him as through a pane of glass at their familiars beyond. Whatever they were to him, he to them was not on the spot at all, and yet he had fancied he would be close to their lives by coming there. But the future lay ahead after all, and if he could only be so fortunate as to get into good employment, he would put up with the inevitable. So he thanked God for his health and strength, and took courage. For the present, he was outside the gates of everything, colleges included. Perhaps some day he would be inside. Those palaces of light and leading, he might some day look down on the world through their panes. At length he did receive a message from the stonemason's yard that a job was waiting for him. It was his first encouragement, and he closed with the offer promptly. He was young and strong, or he never could have executed with such zest the undertakings to which he now applied himself, since they involved reading most of the night after working all the day. First, he bought a shaded lamp for 4 and 6pence, and obtained a good light. Then he got pens, paper, and such other necessary books as he had been unable to obtain elsewhere. Then, to the consternation of his landlady, he shifted all the furniture of his room, a single one for living and sleeping, rigged up a curtain on a rope across the middle to make a double chamber out of one, hung up a thick blind that nobody should know how he was curtailing the hours of sleep, laid out his books, and sat down. Having been deeply encumbered by marrying, getting a cottage, and buying the furniture which had disappeared in the wake of his wife, he had never been able to save any money since the time of those disastrous ventures. Until his wages began to come in, he was obliged to live in the narrowest way. After buying a book or two, he could not even afford himself a fire, and when the nights reeked with the raw and cold air from the meadows, he sat over his lamp in a greatcoat, hat, and woolen gloves. From his window he could perceive the spire of the cathedral, and the ogee dome under which resounded the great bell of the city. The tall tower, tall belfry windows, and tall pinnacles of the college by the bridge he could also get a glimpse of by going to the staircase. These objects he used as stimulants when his faith in the future was dim. Like enthusiasts in general, he made no inquiries into details of procedure. Picking up general notions from casual acquaintance, he never dwelt upon them. For the present, he said to himself, the one thing necessary was to get ready by accumulating money and knowledge, and await whatever chances were afforded to such an one of becoming a son of the university. For wisdom is a defence, and money is a defence, but the excellency of knowledge is, that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. His desire absorbed him, and left no part of him to weigh its practicability. At this time he received a nervously anxious letter from his poor old aunt, on the subject which had previously distressed her, a fear that Jude would not be strong-minded enough to keep away from his cousin Sue Bridehead and her relations. Sue's father, his aunt believed, had gone back to London, but the girl remained at Christminster. To make her still more objectionable, she was an artist or designer of some sort in what was called an ecclesiastical warehouse, which was a perfect seed-bed of idolatry, and she was no doubt abandoned to mummeries on that account, if not quite a papist. Miss Drusilla Fawley was of her date evangelical. As Jude was rather on an intellectual track than a theological, this news of Sue's probable opinions did not much influence him one way or the other, but the clue to her whereabouts was decidedly interesting. With an altogether singular pleasure he walked at his earliest spare minutes past the shops answering to his great-aunt's description, and beheld in one of them a young girl sitting behind a desk, who was suspiciously like the original of the portrait. He ventured to enter on a trivial errand, and having made his purchase, lingered on the scene. The shop seemed to be kept entirely by women. It contained Anglican books, stationery, texts, and fancy goods, little plaster angels on brackets, Gothic-framed pictures of saints, ebony crosses that were almost crucifixes, prayer-books that were almost missals. He felt very shy of looking at the girl in the desk. She was so pretty that he could not believe it possible that she should belong to him. Then she spoke to one of the two older women behind the counter, and he recognized in the accents certain qualities of his own voice, softened and sweetened, but his own. What was she doing? He stole a glance round. Before her lay a piece of zinc, cut to the shape of a scroll 3 or 4 feet long, and coated with a dead surface paint on one side. Hereon she was designing or illuminating, in characters of church text, the single word, Alleluia. A sweet, saintly Christian business hers, thought he. Her presence here was now fairly enough explained, her skill in work of this sort having no doubt been acquired from her father's occupation as an ecclesiastical worker in metal. The lettering on which she was engaged was clearly intended to be fixed up in some chancel to assist devotion. He came out. It would have been easy to speak to her there and then, but it seemed scarcely honourable towards his aunt to disregard her request so incontinently. She had used him roughly, but she had brought him up, and the fact of her being powerless to control him lent a pathetic force to a wish that would have been inoperative as an argument. So Jude gave no sign. He would not call upon Sue just yet. He had other reasons against doing so when he had walked away. She seemed so dainty beside himself in his rough working jacket and dusty trousers that he felt he was as yet unready to encounter her as he had felt about Mr. Phillotson. And how possible it was that she had inherited the antipathies of her family and would scorn him as far as a Christian could, particularly when he had told her that unpleasant part of his history which had resulted in his becoming enchained to one of her own sex whom she would certainly not admire. Thus he kept watch over her, and liked to feel she was there. The consciousness of her living presence stimulated him, but she remained more or less an ideal character, about whose form he began to weave curious and fantastic daydreams. Between 2 and 3 weeks afterwards, Jude was engaged with some more men outside Crozier College in Old Time Street in getting a block of worked freestone from a wagon across the pavement before hoisting it to the parapet which they were repairing. Standing in position, the head man said, "Spike when he heave, he-ho!" and they heaved. All of a sudden, as he lifted, his cousin stood close to his elbow, pausing a moment on the bend of her foot till the obstructing object should have been removed. She looked right into his face with liquid, untranslatable eyes that combined, or seemed to him to combine, keenness with tenderness and mystery with both, their expression, as well as that of her lips, taking its life from some words just spoken to a companion and being carried on into his face quite unconsciously. She had no more observed his presence than that of the dust motes which his manipulations raised into the sunbeams. His closeness to her was so suggestive that he trembled, and turned his face away with a shy instinct to prevent her recognizing him, though as she had never once seen him she could not possibly do so, and might very well never have heard even his name. He could perceive that though she was a country girl at bottom, a latter girlhood of some years in London and a womanhood here had taken all rawness out of her. When she was gone, he continued his work, reflecting on her. He had been so caught by her influence that he had taken no count of her general mould and build. He remembered now that she was not a large figure, that she was light and slight, of the type dubbed elegant. That was about all he had seen. There was nothing statuesque in her, all was nervous motion. She was mobile, living, yet a painter might not have called her handsome or beautiful. But the much that she was surprised him. She was quite a long way removed from the rusticity that was his. How could one of his cross-grained, unfortunate, almost accursed stock have contrived to reach this pitch of niceness? London had done it, he supposed. From this moment, the emotion which had been accumulating in his breast as the bottled-up effect of solitude and the poetized locality he dwelt in, insensibly began to precipitate itself on this half-visionary form, and he perceived that, whatever his obedient wish in the contrary direction, he would soon be unable to resist the desire to make himself known to her. He affected to think of her quite in a family way, since there were crushing reasons why he should not and could not think of her in any other. The first reason was that he was married, and it would be wrong. The second was that they were cousins. It was not well for cousins to fall in love, even when circumstances seemed to favor the passion. The third, even were he free, in a family like his own, where marriage usually meant a tragic sadness, marriage with a blood relation would duplicate the adverse conditions, and a tragic sadness might be intensified to a tragic horror. Therefore, again, he would have to think of Sue with only a relation's mutual interest in one belonging to him, regard her in a practical way as someone to be proud of, to talk and nod to, later on to be invited to tea by. the emotion spent on her being rigorously that of a kinsman and well-wisher. So would she be to him, a kindly star, an elevating power, a companion in Anglican worship, a tender friend. 3. But under the various deterrent influences, Jude's instinct was to approach her timidly, and the next Sunday he went to the morning service in the Cathedral Church of Cardinal College to gain a further view of her, for he had found that she frequently attended there. She did not come, and he awaited her in the afternoon, which was finer. He knew that if she came at all, she would approach the building along the eastern side of the great green quadrangle from which it was accessible, and he stood in a corner while the bell was going. A few minutes before the hour for service, she appeared as one of the figures, walking along under the college walls, and at sight of her he advanced up the side opposite and followed her into the building, more than ever glad that he had not as yet revealed himself. To see her, and to be himself unseen and unknown, was enough for him at present. He lingered a while in the vestibule, and the service was some way advanced when he was put into a seat. It was a lowering, mournful, still afternoon, when a religion of some sort seems a necessity to ordinary practical men, and not only a luxury of the emotional and leisured classes. In the dim light and the baffling glare of the clerestory windows he could discern the opposite worshippers indistinctly only, but he saw that Sue was among them. He had not long discovered the exact seat that she occupied, when the chanting of the 119th Psalm, in which the choir was engaged, reached its second part, in quo corrige, the organ changing to a pathetic Gregorian tune as the singers gave forth, "Wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his way?" It was the very question that was engaging Jude's attention at this moment. What a wicked, worthless fellow he had been to give vent as he had done to an animal passion for a woman, and allow it to lead to such disastrous consequences, then to think of putting an end to himself, then to go recklessly and get drunk. The great waves of pedal music tumbled round the choir, and nursed on the supernatural as he had been, it is not wonderful that he could hardly believe that the psalm was not specially set by some regardful providence for this moment of his first entry into the solemn building. And yet it was the ordinary psalm for the 24th evening of the month. The girl for whom he was beginning to nourish an extraordinary tenderness was at this time ensphered by the same harmonies as those which floated into his ears, and the thought was a delight to him. She was probably a frequenter of this place, and, steeped body and soul in church sentiment as she must be by occupation and habit, had, no doubt, much in common with him. To an impressionable and lonely young man, the consciousness of having at last found anchorage for his thoughts, which promised to supply both social and spiritual possibilities, was like the dew of Hermon, and he remained throughout the service in a sustaining atmosphere of ecstasy. Though he was loath to suspect it, some people might have said to him that the atmosphere blew as distinctly from Cyprus as from Galilee. Jude waited till she had left her seat, and passed under the screen before he himself moved. She did not look towards him, and by the time he reached the door she was halfway down the broad path. Being dressed up in his Sunday suit, he was inclined to follow her and reveal himself, but he was not quite ready, and, alas, ought he to do so with the kind of feeling that was awakening in him? Although it had seemed to have an ecclesiastical basis during the service, and he had persuaded himself that such was the case, he could not altogether be blind to the real nature of the magnetism. She was such a stranger that the kinship was affectation, and he said, "It can't be. I, a man with a wife, must not know her." Still, Sue was his own kin, and the fact of his having a wife, even though she was not in evidence in this hemisphere, might be a help in one sense. It would put all thought of a tender wish on his part out of Sue's mind, and make her intercourse with him free and fearless. It was with some heartache that he saw how little he cared for the freedom and fearlessness that would result in her from such knowledge. Some little time before the date of this service in the cathedral, the pretty, liquid-eyed, light-footed young woman Sue Bridehead had an afternoon's holiday, and leaving the ecclesiastical establishment in which she not only assisted but lodged, took a walk in the country with a book in her hand. It was one of those cloudless days which sometimes occur in Wessex and elsewhere, between days of cold and wet, as if intercalated by caprice of the weather god. She went along for a mile or two until she came to much higher ground than that of the city she had left behind her. The road passed between green fields, and coming to a stile, Sue paused there to finish the page she was reading, and then looked back at the towers and domes and pinnacles, new and old. On the other side of the stile, in the footpath, she beheld a foreigner with black hair and a sallow face, sitting on the grass besides a large square board whereon were fixed, as closely as they could stand, a number of plaster statuettes, some of them bronzed, which he was rearranging before proceeding with them on his way. They were in the main reduced copies of ancient marbles, and comprised divinities of a very different character from those the girl was accustomed to see portrayed, among them being a Venus of standard pattern, a Diana, and, of the other sex, Apollo, Bacchus, and Mars. Though the figures were many yards away from her, the southwest sun brought them out so brilliantly against the green herbage that she could discern their contours with luminous distinctness, and being almost in a line between herself and the church towers of the city, they awoke in her an oddly foreign and contrasting set of ideas by comparison. The man rose, and, seeing her, politely took off his cap and cried, "Images!" in an accent that agreed with his appearance. In a moment he dexterously lifted upon his knee the great board with its assembled notabilities, divine and human, and raised it to the top of his head, bringing them on to her and resting the board on the stile. First he offered her his smaller wares, the busts of kings and queens, then a minstrel, then a winged Cupid. She shook her head. "How much are these two?" she said, touching with her finger the Venus and the Apollo, the largest figures on the tray. He said she should have them for 10 shillings. "I can't afford that," said Sue. She offered considerably less, and to her surprise the image man drew them from their wire stay and handed them over the stile. She clasped them as treasures. When they were paid for, and the man had gone, she began to be concerned as to what she would do with them. They seemed so very large now that they were in her possession, and so very naked. Being of a nervous temperament, she trembled at her enterprise. When she handled them, the white pipe-clay came off on her gloves and jacket. After carrying them along a little way openly, an idea came to her, and pulling some huge burdock leaves, parsley, and other rank growths from the hedge, she wrapped up her burden as well as she could in these, so that what she carried appeared to be an enormous armful of green stuff gathered by a zealous lover of nature. "Well, anything is better than those everlasting church fallals," she said. But she was still in a trembling state, and seemed almost to wish that she had not bought the figures. Occasionally peeping inside the leaves to see that Venus's arm was not broken, she entered with her heathen load into the most Christian city in the country by an obscure street running parallel to the main one, and round a corner to the side door of the establishment to which she was attached. Her purchases were taken straight up to her own chamber, and she at once attempted to lock them in a box that was her very own property, but finding them too cumbersome, she wrapped them in large sheets of brown paper and stood them on the floor in a corner. The mistress of the house, Miss Fontover, was an elderly lady in spectacles, dressed almost like an abbess. A dab at ritual, as became one of her business, and a worshipper at the ceremonial church of St. Silas in the suburb of Beersheba before mentioned, which Jude also had begun to attend. The mistress of the house, Miss Fontover, was an elderly lady in spectacles, dressed almost like an abbess. A dab at ritual, as became one of her business, and a worshipper at the ceremonial church of St. Silas in the suburb of Beersheba before mentioned, which Jude also had begun to attend. She was the daughter of a clergyman in reduced circumstances, and at his death, which had occurred several years before this date, she boldly avoided penury by taking over a little shop of church requisites and developing it to its present creditable proportions. She wore a cross and beads round her neck as her only ornament, and knew the Christian year by heart. She now came to call Sue to tea, and finding that the girl did not respond for a moment, entered the room just as the other was hastily putting a string around each parcel. "Something you have been buying, Miss Bridehead?" she asked, regarding the enwrapped objects. "Yes, just something to ornament my room," said Sue. "Well, I should have thought I had put enough here already," said Miss Fontover, looking round at the Gothic-framed prints of saints, the church text scrolls and other articles, which having become too stale to sell had been used to furnish this obscure chamber. "What is it? How bulky?" She tore a little hole, about as big as a wafer, in the brown paper and tried to peep in. "Why, statuary? 2 figures? Where did you get them?" "Oh, I bought them of a travelling man who sells casts." "2 saints?" "Yes." "What ones?" "St. Peter and St. Mary Magdalene." "Well, now, come down to tea, and go finish that organ text, if there's light enough afterwards." These little obstacles to the indulgence of what had been the merest passing fancy created in Sue a great zest for unpacking her objects and looking at them, and at bedtime, when she was sure of being undisturbed, she unrobed the divinities in comfort. Placing the pair of figures on the chest of drawers, a candle on each side of them, she withdrew to the bed, flung herself down thereon, and began reading a book she had taken from her box, which Miss Fontover knew nothing of. It was a volume of Gibbon, and she read the chapter dealing with the reign of Julian the Apostate. Occasionally she looked up at the statuettes, which appeared strange and out of place, there happening to be a Calvary print hanging between them, and as if the scene suggested the action, she at length jumped up and withdrew another book from her box, a volume of verse, and turned to the familiar poem, "Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean, the world has grown grey from thy breath," which she read to the end. Presently she put out the candles, undressed, and finally extinguished her own light. She was of an age which usually sleeps soundly, yet tonight she kept waking up, and every time she opened her eyes there was enough diffused light from the street to show her the white plaster figures standing on the chest of drawers in odd contrast to their environment of text and martyr, and the Gothic-framed crucifix picture that was only discernible now as a Latin cross, the figure thereon being obscured by the shades. On one of these occasions the church clocks struck some small hour. It fell upon the ears of another person who sat bending over his books at a not very distant spot in the same city. Being Saturday night, the morrow was one on which Jude had not set his alarm clock to call him at his usually early time, and hence he had stayed up, as was his custom, 2 or 3 hours later than he could afford to do on any other day of the week. Just then he was earnestly reading from his Griesbach's text, At the very time that Sue was tossing and staring at her figures, the policemen and belated citizens passing along under his window might have heard, if they had stood still, strange syllables mumbled with fervour within, words that had for Jude an indescribable enchantment, inexplicable sounds, something like these: All himin heis theos hopater, ex hau tapanta kai hemis eis oton, till the sounds rolled with reverent loudness, as a book was heard to close. Kai his kurios Isus Christos, di hau tapanta kai hemis diato. 4. He was a handyman at his trade, an all-round man, as artisans in country towns are apt to be. In London, the man who carves the boss or knob of leafage declines to cut the fragment of moulding which merges in that leafage, as if it were a degradation to do the second half of one whole. When there was not much Gothic moulding for Jude to run, or much window tracery on the bankers, he would go out lettering monuments or tombstones, and take a pleasure in the change of handiwork. The next time that he saw her was when he was on a ladder executing a job of this sort inside one of the churches. There was a short morning service, and when the parson entered, Jude came down from his ladder and sat with the half-dozen people forming the congregation till the prayer should be ended and he could resume his tapping. He did not observe till the service was half over that one of the women was Sue, who had perforce accompanied the elderly Miss Fontover thither. Jude sat watching her pretty shoulders, her easy, curiously nonchalant risings and sittings, and her perfunctory genuflections, and thought what a help such an Anglican would have been to him in happier circumstances. It was not so much his anxiety to get on with his work that made him go up to it immediately the worshippers began to take their leave. It was that he dared not, in this holy spot, confront the woman who was beginning to influence him in such an indescribable manner. Those 3 enormous reasons why he must not attempt intimate acquaintance with Sue Bridehead, now that his interest in her had shown itself to be unmistakably of a sexual kind, loomed as stubbornly as ever. But it was also obvious that man could not live by work alone, that the particular man, Jude, at any rate wanted something to love. Some men would have rushed incontinently to her, snatched the pleasure of easy friendship which she could hardly refuse, and have left the rest to chance. Not so Jude, at first. But as the days, and still more particularly the lonely evenings, dragged along, he found himself, to his moral consternation, to be thinking more of her instead of thinking less of her, and experiencing a fearful bliss in doing what was erratic, informal, and unexpected. Surrounded by her influence all day, walking past the spots she frequented, he was always thinking of her, and was obliged to own to himself that his conscience was likely to be the loser in this battle. To be sure, she was almost an ideality to him still. Perhaps to know her would be to cure himself of this unexpected and unauthorized passion. A voice whispered that, though he desired to know her, he did not desire to be cured. There was not the least doubt that from his own orthodox point of view the situation was growing immoral. For Sue to be the loved one of a man who was licensed by the laws of his country to love Arabella and none other until his life's end was a pretty bad second beginning when the man was bent on such a course as Jude purposed. This conviction was so real with him that one day when, as was frequent, he was at work in a neighbouring village church alone, he felt it to be his duty to pray against his weakness. But much as he wished to be an exemplar in these things, he could not get on. It was quite impossible, he found, to ask to be delivered from temptation when your heart's desire was to be tempted into 70 times 7, so he excused himself. "After all," he said, "it is not altogether an erotolepsy that is the matter with me, as at the first time. I can see that she is exceptionally bright, and it is partly a wish for intellectual sympathy and a craving for loving kindness in my solitude." Thus he went on adoring her, fearing to realize that it was human perversity. For whatever Sue's virtues, talents, or ecclesiastical saturation, it was certain that those items were not at all the cause of his affection for her. On an afternoon at this time, a young girl entered the stonemason's yard with some hesitation, and lifting her skirts to avoid dragging them in the white dust, crossed towards the office. "That's a nice girl," said one of the men, known as Uncle Joe. "Who is she?" asked another. "I don't know. I've seen her about here and there. Why, yes, she's the daughter of that clever chap, Bridhead, who did all the wrought iron work at St. Silas's 10 years ago and went away to London afterwards. I don't know what he's doing now. Not much, I fancy, as she's come back here." Meanwhile, the young woman had knocked at the office door and asked if Mr. Jude Fawley was at work in the yard. It so happened that Jude had gone out somewhere or other that afternoon, which information she received with a look of disappointment, and went away immediately. When Jude returned, they told him, and described her, whereupon he exclaimed, "Why, that's my cousin Sue!" He looked along the street after her, but she was out of sight. He had no longer any thought of a conscientious avoidance of her, and resolved to call upon her that very evening. And when he reached his lodging, he found a note from her, a first note, one of those documents which, simple and commonplace in themselves, are seen retrospectively to have been pregnant with impassioned consequences. The very unconsciousness of a looming drama which is shown in such innocent first epistles from women to men, or vice versa, makes them, when such a drama follows, and they are read over by the purple or lurid light of it, all the more impressive, solemn, and in cases terrible. Sue's was of the most artless and natural kind. She addressed him as her dear cousin Jude, said she had only just learnt by the merest accident that he was living in Christminster, and reproached him with not letting her know. They might have had such nice times together, she said, for she was thrown much upon herself, and had hardly any congenial friend. But now there was every probability of her soon going away, so that the chance of companionship would be lost perhaps forever. A cold sweat overspread Jude at the news that she was going away. That was a contingency he had never thought of, and it spurred him to write all the more quickly to her. He would meet her that very evening, he said, 1 hour from the time of writing, at the cross in the pavement which marks the spot of the martyrdoms. When he had dispatched the note by a boy, he regretted that in his hurry he should have suggested to her to meet him out of doors, when he might have said he would call upon her. It was, in fact, the country custom to meet thus, and nothing else had occurred to him. Arabella had been met in the same way, unfortunately, and it might not seem respectable to a dear girl like Sue. However, it could not be helped now, and he moved towards the point a few minutes before the hour, under the glimmer of the newly lighted lamps. The broad street was silent, and almost deserted, although it was not late. He saw a figure on the other side, which turned out to be hers, and they both converged towards the cross-mark at the same moment. Before either had reached it, she called out to him, "I am not going to meet you just there, for the first time in my life. Come further on." The voice, though positive and silvery, had been tremulous. They walked on in parallel lines, and waiting her pleasure, Jude watched till she showed signs of closing in, when he did likewise, the place being where the carrier's cart stood in the daytime, though there was none on the spot then. "I am sorry that I asked you to meet me and didn't call," began Jude, with the bashfulness of a lover, "but I thought it would save time if we were going to walk." "Oh, I don't mind that," she said with the freedom of a friend. "I have really no place to ask anybody into. What I meant was that the place you chose was so horrid. I suppose I ought not to say horrid. I mean gloomy and inauspicious in its associations. But isn't it funny to begin like this when I don't know you yet?" She looked him up and down curiously, though Jude did not look much at her. "You seem to know me more than I know you," she added. "Yes, I have seen you now and then." "And you knew who I was, and didn't speak, and now I am going away." "Yes, that's unfortunate. I have hardly any other friend. I have, indeed, one very old friend here somewhere, but I don't quite like to call on him just yet. I wonder if you know anything of him, Mr. Phillotson. A parson somewhere about the county, I think he is." "No, I only know of one Mr. Phillotson. He lives a little way out in the country, at Lumsden. He's a village schoolmaster." "Ah, I wonder if he's the same. Surely it is impossible. Only a schoolmaster still? Do you know his Christian name? Is it Richard?" "Yes, it is. I've directed books to him, though I've never seen him." "Then he couldn't do it." Jude's countenance fell, for how could he succeed in an enterprise wherein the great Phillotson had failed? He would have had a day of despair if the news had not arrived during his sweet Sue's presence, but even at this moment he had visions of how Phillotson's failure in the grand university scheme would depress him when she had gone. "As we are going to take a walk, suppose we go and call upon him," said Jude suddenly. "It is not late." She agreed, and they went along up a hill and through some prettily wooded country. Presently the embattled tower and square turret of the church rose into the sky, and then the schoolhouse. They inquired of a person in the street if Mr. Phillotson was likely to be at home, and were informed that he was always at home. A knock brought him to the schoolhouse door, with a candle in his hand, and a look of inquiry on his face, which had grown thin and careworn since Jude last set eyes on him. That after all these years the meeting with Mr. Phillotson should be of this homely complexion destroyed at one stroke the halo which had surrounded the schoolmaster's figure in Jude's imagination ever since their parting. It created in him at the same time a sympathy with Phillotson as an obviously much chastened and disappointed man. Jude told him his name, and said he had come to see him as an old friend who had been kind to him in his youthful days. "I don't remember you in the least," said the schoolmaster thoughtfully. "You were one of my pupils, you say?" "Yes, no doubt. But they number so many thousands by this time of my life, and have naturally changed so much that I remember very few except the quite recent ones." "It was out at Mary Green," said Jude, wishing he had not come. "Yes, I was there a short time. And this is an old pupil too?" "No, that's my cousin. I wrote to you for some grammars, if you recollect, and you sent them." "Ah, yes, I do dimly recall that incident." "It was very kind of you to do it, and it was you who first started me on that course. In the morning you left Mary Green, when your goods were on the wagon, you wished me good-bye, and said your scheme was to be a university man and enter the church, that the degree was the necessary hall-mark of one who wanted to do anything as a theologian or teacher. I remember I thought all that privately, but I wonder I did not keep my own counsel. The idea was given up years ago. I have never forgotten it. It was that which brought me to this part of the country and out here to see you tonight." "Come in," said Phillotson. and your cousin too." They entered the parlour of the schoolhouse, where there was a lamp with a paper shade, which threw the light down on 3 or 4 books. Phillotson took it off so that they could see each other better, and the rays fell on the nervous little face and vivacious dark eyes and hair of Sue, on the earnest features of her cousin, and on the schoolmaster's own maturer face and figure, showing him to be a spare and thoughtful personage of 45, with a thin-lipped, somewhat refined mouth, a slightly stooping habit, and a black frock coat, which from continued frictions shone a little at the shoulder-blades, the middle of the back, and the elbows. The old friendship was imperceptibly renewed, the schoolmaster speaking of his experiences, and the cousins of theirs. He told them that he still thought of the church sometimes, and that though he could not enter it as he had intended to do in former years, he might enter it as a licentiate. Meanwhile, he said, he was comfortable in his present position, though he was in want of a pupil-teacher. They did not stay to supper, Sue having to be indoors before it grew late, and the road was retraced to Christminster. Though they had talked of nothing more than general subjects, Jude was surprised to find what a revelation of woman his cousin was to him. She was so vibrant that everything she did seemed to have its source in feeling. An exciting thought would make her walk ahead so fast that he could hardly keep up with her, and her sensitiveness on some points was such that it might have been misread as vanity. It was with heart-sickness he perceived that, while her sentiments towards him were those of the frankest friendliness only, he loved her more than before becoming acquainted with her, and the gloom of the walk home lay not in the night overhead, but in the thought of her departure. "Why must you leave Christminster?" he said, regretfully. "How can you do otherwise than cling to a city in whose history such men as Newman, Pusey, Ward, Keble loom so large?" "Yes, they do. Though how large do they loom in the history of the world? What a funny reason for caring to stay! I should never have thought of it." She laughed. "Well, I must go," she continued. "Miss Fontover, one of the partners whom I serve, is offended with me, and I with her, and it is best to go." "How did that happen?" "She broke some statuary of mine." "Oh, wilfully?" "Yes. She found it in my room, and though it was my property, she threw it on the floor and stamped on it because it was not according to her taste, and ground the arms and the head of one of the figures all to bits with her heel. A horrid thing." "Too Catholic apostolic for her, I suppose?" "No doubt. She called them popish images, and talked of the invocation of saints." No, she didn't do that. She saw the matter quite differently." "Ah, then I am surprised." "Yes, it was for quite some other reason that she didn't like my patron saints. So I was led to retort upon her, and the end of it was that I resolved not to stay, but to get into an occupation in which I shall be more independent." "Why don't you try teaching again? You once did, I heard." "I never thought of resuming it, for I was getting on as an art designer." "Do let me ask Mr. Phillotson to let you try your hand in his school. If you like it, and go to a training college and become a first-class certified mistress, you get twice as large an income as any designer or church artist, and twice as much freedom." "Well, ask him. Now I must go in. Good-bye, dear Jude. I'm so glad we've met at last. We needn't quarrel because our parents did, need we?" Jude did not like to let her see quite how much he agreed with her, and went his way to the remote street in which he had his lodging. To keep Sue Bridehead near him was now a desire which operated without regard of consequences, and the next evening he again set out for Lumsden, fearing to trust to the persuasive effects of a note only. The schoolmaster was unprepared for such a proposal. "What I rather wanted was a second year's transfer, as it is called," he said. "Of course your cousin would do, personally, But she has had no experience." "Oh, she has she? Does she really think of adopting teaching as a profession?" Jude said she was disposed to do so, he thought, and his ingenious arguments on her natural fitness for assisting Mr. Phillotson, of which Jude knew nothing whatever, so influenced the schoolmaster that he said he would engage her, assuring Jude as a friend that unless his cousin really meant to follow on in the same course, and regarded this step as the first stage of an apprenticeship, of which her training in a normal school would be the second stage, her time would be wasted quite, the salary being merely nominal. The day after this visit, Phillotson received a letter from Jude, containing the information that he had again consulted his cousin, who took more and more warmly to the idea of tuition, and that she had agreed to come. It did not occur for a moment to the schoolmaster and recluse that Jude's ardour in promoting the arrangement arose from any other feelings towards Sue than the instinct of co-operation common among members of the same family. 5. The schoolmaster sat in his homely dwelling attached to the school, both being modern erections, and he looked across the way at the old house in which his teacher Sue had a lodging. The arrangement had been concluded very quickly. A pupil-teacher who was to have been transferred to Mr. Phillotson's school had failed him, and Sue had been taken as a stopgap. All such provisional arrangements as these could only last till the next annual visit of Her Majesty's Inspector, whose approval was necessary to make them permanent. Having taught for some 2 years in London, though she had abandoned that vocation of late, Miss Brighthead was not exactly a novice, and Mr. Phillotson thought there would be no difficulty in retaining her services, which he already wished to do, though she had only been with him 3 or 4 weeks. He had found her quite as bright as Jude had described her, and what master tradesman does not wish to keep an apprentice who saves him half his labour? It was a little over 8:30 o'clock in the morning, and he was waiting to see her cross the road to the school, when he would follow. At 20 minutes to 9 she did cross, a light hat tossed on her head, and he watched her as a curiosity. A new emanation, which had nothing to do with her skill as a teacher, seemed to surround her this morning. He went to the school also, and Sue remained governing her class at the other end of the room all day under his eye. She certainly was an excellent teacher. It was part of his duty to give her private lessons in the evening, and some article in the code made it necessary that a respectable elderly woman should be present at these lessons when the teacher and the taught were of different sexes. Richard Phillotson thought of the absurdity of the regulation in this case when he was old enough to be the girl's father, but he faithfully acted up to it, and sat down with her in a room where Mrs. Hawes, the widow at whose house Sue lodged, occupied herself with sewing. The regulation was, indeed, not easy to evade, for there was no other sitting-room in the dwelling. Sometimes, as she figured, it was arithmetic that they were working at, she would involuntarily glance up with a little inquiring smile at him, as if she assumed that, being the master, he must perceive all that was passing in her brain, as right or wrong. Phillotson was not really thinking of the arithmetic at all, but of her, in a novel way which somehow seemed strange to him as preceptor. Perhaps she knew that he was thinking of her thus. For a few weeks their work had gone on with a monotony which in itself was a delight to him. Then it happened that the children were to be taken to Christminster to see an itinerant exhibition in the shape of a model of Jerusalem, to which schools were admitted at a penny a head in the interests of education. They marched along the road 2 and 2, she beside her class with her simple cotton sunshade, her little thumb cocked up against its stem, and Phillotson behind in his long dangling coat, handling his walking-stick genteelly, in the musing mood which had come over him since her arrival. The afternoon was one of sun and dust, and when they entered the exhibition room, few people were present but themselves. The model of the ancient city stood in the middle of the apartment, and the proprietor, with a fine religious philanthropy written on his features, walked round it with a pointer in his hand, showing the young people the various quarters and places known to them by name from reading their Bibles: Mount Moriah, the Valley of Jehoshaphat, the City of Zion, the walls and the gates, outside one of which there was a large mound like a tumulus, and on the mound a little white cross. The spot, he said, was Calvary. "I think," said Sue to the schoolmaster, as she stood with him a little in the background, "that this model, elaborate as it is a very imaginary production. How does anybody know that Jerusalem was like this in the time of Christ? I am sure this man doesn't." "It is made after the best conjectural maps, based on actual visits to the city as it now exists." "I fancy we have had enough of Jerusalem," she said, "considering we are not descended from the Jews. There was nothing first-rate about the place or people after all, as there was about Athens, Rome, Alexandria, and other old cities." "But, my dear girl, consider what it is to us." She was silent, for she was easily repressed, and then perceived behind the group of children clustered round the model a young man in a white flannel jacket, his form being bent so low in his intent inspection of the Valley of Jehoshaphat that his face was almost hidden from view by the Mount of Olives. "Look at your cousin Jude," continued the schoolmaster. "He doesn't think we have had enough of Jerusalem." "Ah, I didn't see him," she cried in her quick, light voice. "Jude, how seriously you're going into it." Jude started up from his reverie and saw her. "Oh, Sue," he said, with a glad flush of embarrassment. "These are your school children, of course. I saw that schools were admitted in the afternoons and thought you might come, but I got so deeply interested that I didn't remember where I was. How it carries one back, doesn't it? I could examine it for hours, but I have only a few minutes, unfortunately, for I am in the middle of a job out here." "Your cousin is so terribly clever that she criticizes it unmercifully," said Phillotson, with good-humoured satire. "She is quite sceptical as to its correctness." "No, Mr. Phillotson, I am not, altogether. I hate to be what is called a clever girl. There are too many of that sort now," answered Sue, sensitively. "I only meant—I don't know what I meant, except that it was what you don't understand." "I know your meaning," said Jude ardently, although he did not, "and I think you are quite right." "That's a good Jude. I know you believe in me." She impulsively seized his hand, and leaving a reproachful look on the schoolmaster, turned away to Jude, her voice revealing a tremor which she herself felt to be absurdly uncalled for by sarcasm so gentle. She had not the least conception how the hearts of the twain went out to her at this momentary revelation of feeling, and what a complication she was building up thereby in the futures of both. The model wore too much of an educational aspect for the children not to tire of it soon, and a little later in the afternoon they were all marched back to Lumsden, Jude returning to his work. He watched the juvenile flock in their clean frocks and pinafores filing down the street towards the country beside Phillotson and Sue, and a sad, dissatisfied sense of being out of the scheme of the latter's lives had possession of him. Phillotson had invited him to walk out and see them on Friday evening, when there would be no lessons to give to Sue, and Jude had eagerly promised to avail himself of the opportunity. Meanwhile, the scholars and teachers moved homewards, and the next day, on looking on the blackboard in Sue's class, Phillotson was surprised to find upon it, skilfully drawn in chalk, a perspective view of Jerusalem, with every building shown in its place. "I thought you took no interest in the model, and hardly looked at it," he said. "I hardly did," said she, "but I remembered that much of it. It is more than I had remembered myself." Her Majesty's school inspector was at that time paying surprise visits in this neighbourhood to test the teaching unawares, and 2 days later, in the middle of the morning lessons, the latch of the door was softly lifted, and in walked my gentleman, the king of terrors, 2 pupil teachers. To Mr. Phillotson the surprise was not great. Like the lady in the story, he had been played that trick too many times to be unprepared. But Sue's class was at the further end of the room, and her back was towards the entrance. The inspector therefore came and stood behind her and watched her teaching some half-minute before she became aware of his presence. She turned and realized that an oft-dreaded moment had come. The effect upon her timidity was such that she uttered a cry of fright. Phillotson, with the strange instinct of solicitude quite beyond his control, was at her side just in time to prevent her falling from faintness. She soon recovered herself and laughed, but when the inspector had gone there was a reaction, and she was so white that Phillotson took her into his room and gave her some brandy to bring her round. She found him holding her hand. "You ought to have told me," she gasped petulantly, "that one of the inspector's surprise visits was imminent. Oh, what shall I do? Now he'll write and tell the managers that I am no good, and I shall be disgraced forever." "He won't do that, my dear little girl. You are the best teacher ever I had." He looked so gently at her that she was moved, and regretted that she had upbraided him. When she was better, she went home. Jude, in the meantime, had been waiting impatiently for Friday. On both Wednesday and Thursday he had been so much under the influence of his desire to see her that he walked after dark some distance along the road in the direction of the village, and, on returning to his room to read, found himself quite unable to concentrate his mind on the page. On Friday, as soon as he had got himself up, as he thought Sue would like to see him, and made a hasty tea, he set out, notwithstanding that the evening was wet. The trees overhead deepened the gloom of the hour, and they dripped sadly upon him, impressing him with forebodings, illogical forebodings, for though he knew that he loved her, he also knew that he could not be more to her than he was. On turning the corner and entering the village, the first sight that greeted his eyes was that of 2 figures under one umbrella coming out of the vicarage gate. He was too far back for them to notice him, but he knew in a moment that they were Sue and Phillotson. The latter was holding the umbrella over her head, and they had evidently been paying a visit to the vicar, probably on some business connected with the schoolwork. And as they walked along the wet and deserted lane, Jude saw Phillotson place his arm round the girl's waist, whereupon she gently removed it, but he replaced it, and she let it remain, looking quickly round her with an air of misgiving. She did not look absolutely behind her, and therefore did not see Jude, who sank into the hedge like one struck with a blight. There he remained hidden till they had reached Sue's cottage, and she had passed in, Phillotson going on to the school hard by. "Oh, he is too old for her, too old!" cried Jude, in all the terrible sickness of hopeless, handicapped love. He could not interfere. Was he not Arabella's? He was unable to go on further, and retraced his steps towards Christminster. Every tread of his feet seemed to say to him that he must on no account stand in the schoolmaster's way with Sue. Phillotson was perhaps 20 years her senior, but many a happy marriage had been made in such conditions of age. The ironical clinch to his sorrow was given by the thought that the intimacy between his cousin and the schoolmaster had been brought about entirely by himself. 6. Jude's old and embittered aunt lay unwell at Mary Green, and on the following Sunday he went to see her, a visit which was the result of a victorious struggle against his inclination to turn aside to the village of Lumsden and obtain a miserable interview with his cousin, in which the word nearest his heart could not be spoken, and the sight which had tortured him could not be revealed. His aunt was now unable to leave her bed. and a great part of Jude's short day was occupied in making arrangements for her comfort. The little bakery business had been sold to a neighbour, and with the proceeds of this and her savings she was comfortably supplied with necessaries and more, a widow of the same village living with her and ministering to her wants. It was not till the time had nearly come for him to leave that he obtained a quiet talk with her, and his words tended insensibly towards his cousin. "Was Sue born here?" "She was. In this room. They were living here at that time. What made he ask that?" "Oh, I wanted to know." "Now you've been seeing her," said the harsh old woman. "And what did I tell 'ee?" "Well, that I was not to see her." "Have you gossiped with her?" "Yes." "Then don't keep it up. She was brought up by her father to hate her mother's family, and she'll look with no favour upon a working chap like you, a townish girl as she's become by now. I never cared much about her. Pert little thing, that's what she was too often, with her tight strained nerves. Many's the time I've smacked her for her impertinence. Why, one day she was walking into the pond with her shoes and stockings off, and her petticoats pulled above her knees. Afore I could cry out for shame, she said, 'Move on, auntie. This is no sight for modest eyes.' She was a little child then. She was 12 if a day." "Well, of course. But now she's older she's of a thoughtful, quivering, tender nature, and as sensitive as—" "Jude!" cried his aunt, springing up in bed. "Don't you be a fool about her." "No, no, of course not." "Your marrying that woman Arabella was about as bad a thing as a man could possibly do for himself by trying hard. She's gone to the other side of the world, and med never trouble you again. And there'll be a worse thing if you, tied and bound as you be, should have a fancy for Sue. If your cousin is civil to you, take her civility for what it is worth. But anything more than a relation's good wishes, it is stark madness for 'ee to give her. If she's townish and wanton, it med bring 'ee to ruin." "Don't say anything against her, aunt. Don't, please." A relief was afforded to him by the entry of the companion and nurse of his aunt, who must have been listening to the conversation, for she began a commentary on past years, introducing Sue Bridehead as a character in her recollections. She described what an odd little maid Sue had been when a pupil at the village school across the green opposite, before her father went to London, how, when the vicar arranged readings and recitations, she appeared on the platform, the smallest of them all, in her little white frock and shoes and pink sash, how she recited Excelsior. There was a sound of revelry by night, and the Raven, how during the delivery she would knit her little brows and glare round tragically and say to the empty air as if some real creature stood there, "Ghastly grim and ancient Raven, wandering from the nightly shore, tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." "She'd bring up the nasty carrion bird that clear," corroborated the sick woman reluctantly. "She stood there in her little sash and things, that you could see un almost before your very eyes. You too, Jude, had the same trick as a child of seeming to see things in the air." The neighbour told also of Sue's accomplishments in other kinds. "She was not exactly a tomboy, you know, but she could do things that only boys do, as a rule. I've seen her hit in and steer down the long slide on yonder pond, with her little curls blowing, one of a file of 20 moving along against the skyline like shapes painted on glass, and up the back slide without stopping. All boys except herself, and then they'd cheer her, and then she'd say, 'Don't be saucy, boys,' and suddenly run indoors. They'd try to coax her out again, but they wouldn't come." These retrospective visions of Sue only made Jude the more miserable that he was unable to woo her, and he left the cottage of his aunt that day with a heavy heart. He would fain have glanced into the school to see the room in which Sue's little figure had so glorified itself, but he checked his desire and went on. It being Sunday evening, some villagers who had known him during his residence here were standing in a group in their best clothes. Jude was startled by a salute from one of them. "You've got there right enough, then." Jude showed that he did not understand. "Why, to the seat of learning, the city of light you used to talk to us about as a little boy. Is it all you expected of it?" "Yes, more," cried Jude.